Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback and enjoy the story. Following the order of the Marshal of the East, a few days later, news about the fierce battle between Lu Sheng and Zhao Jai spread everywhere. Lu Sheng's smiling face was on the front page of all newspapers, and according to reports, the unparalleled martial genius Lu Sheng, at the age of 20, had killed more than 32 members of Ninghai's extreme martial dojo. But the most important news was that our boy had defeated Martial Saint Zhao Jai, who fled on the brink of death like a coward. A man with a mustache who was calmly working on his computer and drinking a glass of water decided to read the newspaper. His eyes widened in surprise, causing him to spit out the water. He couldn't believe that Lu Sheng had defeated the martial saint of the extreme dojo. Lu Sheng was still missing, and no one knew if he was alive or not. Naturally, the news also reached Lu Sheng's family. Upon learning that her son had disappeared, the mother, who was holding the newspaper, fell to her knees on the ground and couldn't help but cry in sadness. The daughter sat next to her mother and with a sad gaze began to console her. The father, who was behind them, gave them a hug, promising that Lu Sheng must still be alive. Somewhere else, in a military base of the Eastern Army, Snowy and Qin were standing in front of a table with a large number of newspapers. Both remained silent, not knowing what to do. Qin began to read the news, and his eyes filled with surprise and fear. The Supreme Martial Saint had managed to survive the battle between the Dragon Kingdom and the Lion back then. But even in that great war, he had not been injured to the point of being on the brink of death. Snowy, who was next to him with her arms crossed, started gazing at the ground with a lost expression. Qin began to remember Lu Sheng smiling and surrounded by powerful martial flames. He was in shock since Zhao Jai had brought with him a great army to catch and kill Lu Sheng. But he had been humiliated by our boy, something out of this world. According to the newspaper, no one knew if Lu Sheng was still alive or not. The only thing known is that his body had sunk to the bottom of the sea after the fierce battle. Qin placed both hands on top of the newspaper and veins started to appear on his hands. He was furious and couldn't believe that the army hadn't been able to find Lu Sheng's body. Snowy, who despite trying not to show any emotion, was ultimately consumed by sadness. Her eyes filled with tears as she began to look at the photograph of Lu Sheng, and in desperation, she firmly believed that he was still alive. Qin turned toward her and with a surprised yet determined expression explained that the entire army had plunged into the sea and were now searching for Lu Sheng everywhere. They were even draining the ocean water as if it were a pond to reach the bottom. His eyes began to shine with determination because he also thought that Lu Sheng was still alive. Snowy remained silent without saying a single word. She was unable to believe that Lu Sheng was dead. Qin's eyes widened with concern. He wanted to know how Lu Sheng's family was doing. With tears in her eyes, she turned around and with a sad gaze revealed that his mother had cried until she fainted several times. But the father and sister were convinced that he would return alive. Qin began pointing at the ceiling with his finger and, with a serious expression, started imagining Doraemon, explaining that he had the feeling there was no need to worry so much since if the army hadn't found Lu Sheng yet, it must mean the situation wasn't clear. He believed that Lu Sheng must be seriously injured and perhaps had some small magical artifact like Doraemon's style, and was alive and discreetly hiding somewhere. He had a hunch that when they saw him again, he would be much stronger than before. Hearing this, Snowy, who was behind him, couldn't help but get angry. She began looking down silently thinking Qin was very childish. Despite pretending to be calm, Qin began to sweat and his eyes filled with despair. He wanted Lu Sheng to hurry and return alive. Somewhere else there were snowy mountains, and somewhere at the top of the mountains was a large and luxurious castle. While the sun was illuminating the hallway of the castle, someone began to scream in agony. It was none other than Zhao Jai, who fell to his knees on the ground and began vomiting and screaming in pain. His eyes began to shine. He clenched his teeth tightly and with a furious expression thirsty for revenge. He felt relieved since luckily, the last time he had used a bottle of soul-fusing liquid. Otherwise, even though his divine martial soul would have escaped, he wouldn't have been able to merge with this cloned body. He was very frustrated. Zhao Jai was furious because Lu Sheng had completely destroyed his true martial body that he had been cultivating for more than 100 years. During the fierce combat, our boy had concentrated the immortal cells in his fist and with a single punch had destroyed Zhao Jai's head as if it were a water balloon. With his body trembling and with the little strength Zhao Jai had, he stood up and couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly due to hatred and frustration, since he knew that returning to the top would take him at least several decades. In this mansion, there were 2 shelves full of containers with red liquids. Zhao Jai began walking toward the shelf, cursing Lu Sheng under his breath. The martial saint grabbed one of the containers, removed its lid, and without a second's hesitation started drinking the liquid. To him, Lu Sheng was a monster who could not be considered human. Zhao Jai was a respectable level 9 martial saint who had been pushed to the limit by a level 8 warrior, and if it weren't for the hidden card that the level 10 expert had given him, he wouldn't have been able to kill Lu Sheng. He began to use his power, causing the containers on the shelf to slowly start flying. These were reinforcement potions, and for Zhao Jai, 1 or 2 potions were not enough, and he still needed more. The lids of the containers opened, and the liquid started to fall over the head of the martial saint. His eyes filled with relief, and a smile appeared on his face, making him begin to feel a sense of tranquility and happiness. A while later, Zhao Jai emptied all the containers, and now there was a puddle of liquid spilled on the floor beneath his feet. Now that he had consumed all the reinforcement potions, his body seemed to have become younger. He clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with determination. Now that he had recovered, a question came to his mind. He did not know how it was possible that on this planet of level 1 resources a genius of this caliber had emerged. Lu Sheng had terrifying power, being only a level 8 warrior. He knew that if he reached level 9, he would be able to leave this planet directly. Zhao Jai felt relieved since this was not going to happen now, because luckily, he was dead. The martial saint put on new clothes, and his eyes filled with seriousness. It had been many years since he felt like this. It was a feeling of helplessness. He knew better than anyone else that this place was no longer safe to stay in. Sooner or later someone would come looking for him. He needed to find protection and ask for help from Tan Zhongyu and Lin Zhengyu. His attention fixed on a chest on the shelf. He felt relieved as he still had it. He approached the chest and opened it. This chest contained energy crystals, with which Tan Zhongyu and Lin Zhengyu were going to do him some favors. The room was full of treasures, gold coins, and powerful crystals. Zhao Jai hid the chest under his cloak, and his eyes filled with worry and alertness. He had to escape as soon as possible, since after all, in his sanctuary there were many relics of martial saints, not only from Longu but even from foreign forces that could come to seize them. He couldn't take all the relics with him, so he decided it was better to leave them behind. Zhao Jai gathered his belongings and began walking down the hallway. Then he descended the mountain without a trace of nostalgia for Tianweifeng. On the coast of City R, it was a wonderful day, and the beach was full of tourists, and among them was a sexy woman with a nice cake. Next to the woman was a muscular man who was smoking a cigar. While they were both walking, the sexy woman turned around towards him and with a curious gaze asked how his trip to Beishizu had gone. She had heard that the scenery there was always beautiful, and it was a place she had always wanted to visit. The man closed his eyes and with a smile casually mentioned that the place wasn't anything extraordinary. He had gone there for routine work. Upon hearing this, the woman's attention fixed on him. With a calm expression, she said that in recent years he had been traveling non-stop. She didn't know what he was looking for on behalf of the Lord, asking if he could tell her about it. The man opened his eyes and made them start to shine, revealing that he was looking for energy crystals. Upon hearing this, the sexy woman couldn't help but clench her fist and be in shock. She was speechless and felt very curious since she didn't know what energy crystals were. For the man, it was normal that she hadn't heard about them. Energy crystals were currently the materials with the highest energy concentration known on Earth. They were also called energy sources. They were extremely scarce and valuable. Only a few places where they were produced were known, and they were under the control of all major powers. Despite being somewhat surprised, the woman remained calm. She began to observe the man and casually asked if energy crystals had any benefit for the martial path. With a serene expression, the man replied yes, explaining that energy crystals were only beneficial for people who were at the level of martial saints. For a level 9 warrior, energy crystals were not only an invaluable cultivation resource, but also a form of currency. Over these years, he had been traveling across more than half the planet trying to find a new deposit of energy crystals for the Lord. The woman put her hand near her mouth and with a smile mocked him, asking if it wasn't too risky to share so many secrets with her, questioning whether he was going to silence her afterward. Upon hearing this, the man's eyes filled with confusion. He took the cigarette out of his mouth and thought she had watched too many movies, explaining that the Great World Tournament of Masters was going to begin in a year, and by then she would inevitably have to participate. And someone would end up telling her about the energy crystals anyway. The Great World Tournament of Masters was an event where the strongest warriors from all over the planet participated. The woman's expression changed, and her eyes widened with seriousness and curiosity. She did not know what connection the Great World Tournament of Masters had with the energy crystals. The tournament was carried out by the most powerful men on the planet, and it was created precisely as a decent way for countries to compete for the allocation of energy crystals. All crystals produced globally were gathered, and each country sent its top-level masters to compete, and the quotas were distributed according to the final results of the tournament. The eyes of the sexy woman filled with surprise, asking if there was also a competition between martial saints from different countries and also among those from the same country. The man closed his eyes and replied that naturally, that was the reason for their existence in Minju Hall, similar to the 4 elephants and the 28 stars under the command of the martial saint of the Extreme Dojo. With a serene gaze, the man mentioned that it was a pity that their martial saint was young and had the shortest trajectory among the 3 martial saints of Longu, his foundation being the weakest. In terms of overall strength, they were far behind both the Extreme Dojo and Superior Dojo. In each distribution of crystals, their lord's share had always been the smallest, with most going to the martial saint of the Extreme Dojo, followed by that of the Superior Dojo. The woman crossed her arms and with a sincere expression explained that it was not surprising that their boss wanted to find a new deposit of energy crystals, as it was better to generate more resources than just limit expenses. While they were talking, an email appeared on the man's watch. He activated the watch, making the messages appear in hologram form. His eyes filled with confusion since he didn't know why an email had arrived now. After reading the email, the man's eyes widened in surprise, causing him to drop his cigarette. He couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Seeing his expression, the woman became curious, not knowing what was happening. He turned to her and with a surprised gaze revealed that in the next Great World Masters tournament, finally their lord's quota was going to be the smallest. The woman's mind filled with curiosity, not knowing why. He began to stare at her intently with a penetrating gaze, revealing that the 4 elephants and the 28 stars of the Extreme Dojo had been completely annihilated by a single person, and the martial saint of the Extreme Dojo had been seriously injured, and now the line of succession of the Extreme Dojo had come to an end. Upon hearing this, the woman couldn't help but be in shock and her eyes began to shine with surprise. She didn't know who had done something so terrifying. Not knowing if there was a 4th martial saint in Longu, the man casually replied that she already knew that person. The woman was confused as she did not remember it. He began to stare at her intently and started imagining Lu Sheng smiling and surrounded by evil energy. He was the young man who had once offended the Extreme Dojo, for whom she had been ordered to go help. However, through his own strength, he had killed Tong Kuizing of the Extreme Dojo. The woman was in shock and it didn't take long for her to realize it was Lu Sheng. Just before they could continue talking, the man turned his back on her, said goodbye to her, and started running. He wanted to inform the Lord about the news of the crystals. The woman remained silently watching, trying to understand what had just happened. She began to touch her elbow and, with a confused gaze, started wondering how it was possible that Lu Sheng had killed the 28 stars and injured the martial saint of the Extreme Dojo. The last time she had seen him, he seemed like an ordinary warrior. The sun was illuminating the ocean, which was full of waves. In the depths of the ocean were skeletons of powerful aquatic beasts and many small fish, and on the seabed lay someone's body surrounded by golden energy. It was Lu Sheng's body. Despite having a hole in his chest, his arms had already healed. While the fish swam peacefully around him, our boy woke up and opened his eyes, which began to shine with determination. For him this was nothing more than